Hi, welcome to Jazz Perspectives. I'm Mike Price from the Fort Worth Business Press. We're visiting with John Case. Johnny Case to you, if you've heard the music emanating from Sardines for what, the past 25 years, John?
Not quite 25, more like 23.
Close enough. Man, you generations worth of music. Known in more recent years as John Kasson. We'll get into that issue somewhat later, but we've got a lot of history to cover. I doubt you'd be the one to claim it, but a lot of people consider you pretty much the dean of jazz piano in Fort Worth. Where did that reputation come from, John? Not that you, I mean, I suspect you know you've earned it long since, but...
No, I don't know about that, but, but that's very nice of you to say, and maybe I've been around longer than anybody else and still playing regularly.
Longevity counts for something.
I guess that counts for a lot.
I got an email from one of your former sidemen several months ago talking about a time when you found yourself confronted with a badly out-of-tune, decrepit piano at the last minute on a gig and tackled it as though it were a new instrument and made it work. The reference was, Johnny makes everything swing.
Well,
You come out of a Western swing tradition, do you not?
I grew up with country music, and my parents were involved in country music, and yes, Western swing being very much part of that scene.
Yeah.
And when I first became interested in becoming a professional musician, it was with the goal of playing jazz. But this was in Paris, Texas.
Paris, Texas.
And there were no opportunities to play jazz, even if one had the ability to play it. And at that point, of course, I didn't. But my older brother, Jerry Case, was already playing professionally.
As a guitarist,
as a
am I correct?
guitarist.
Yes.
And he encouraged me to listen to the Western swing bands that were around for the similarities in the improvisational parts, so that maybe I would see that it would be to my benefit to try to find work in that field.
A great deal of jazz influence in such bands as Bob Wills, would you say?
Sure.
Light Crust Doughboys?
Yes, yes.
And
all the Western swing bands, as you know, allowed musicians to improvise.
Yes, yes. And
the emphasis certainly was on swing. Nothing real subtle about it, but yeah.
Now, your folks, tell me about the family background, the names and the pertinent names and such.
My mother and father were involved in early country music, going back to the days when there was live music on the radio in the 30s and 40s. My father played in a band that his brother led.
Now, his name, their names?
My father's name was J.C. Case.
Yes.
And his brother, Bill Case, had the band. Also, their brother-in-law, Homer Hargrove, was part of it, so it was very much a family operation.
Sure.
Bill played fiddle. My father played mandolin, usually, and sang harmony to Homer Hargrove's lead vocals.
Right.
And later there was a bassist added. His name is Vernon Young. I think he's still around here. The other three are deceased. My mother, Floy Case, became actually better known than any of the others because of her work as a writer. She was a journalist.
Yes.
And has been recognized by the Country Music Foundation in Nashville as one of the pioneer country music journalists. She was also a songwriter, and they counted among their friends from the early 40s Ernest Tubb, Carrie Rogers, and Bill Boyd, and Smokey Montgomery, people like that.
Amazing background. Well, Smokey was in the sessions that I did with Smokey in the early to mid 1980s. I found him to be more tuned to jazz than to anything resembling country music, and there's such a fine and insubstantial barrier between the idioms in the first place. How is it that you have managed to develop this ability and the reputation to match at various forms of jazz and still kept a hand in the countrified forms?
I don't know. It's pretty complex, I guess, but growing up with country music, some of it I truly did like, And I'd have to say the instrument that caught my ear when I was a kid was the steel guitar, not the piano.
Although the piano is your
Although the piano is my
instrument of preference.
It was upon hearing jazz on recordings when I was in my early teens, and I started exploring different types of music as best I could through recordings, that I fell in love with jazz piano. And it was people like Wynton Kelly and Errol Garner, Dave Brubeck, people like that who initially inspired me. But, you know, this love for certain forms of traditional country music were just part of me.
Sure.
And I have to say that even though I started working in country bands, it was kind of weird because to a large degree, I sort of turned my back on country music in order to do what I wanted to do, and all the time I'm trying to become a jazz player, so I'm always practicing and thinking and listening to jazz. And yet at the same time, I'm learning a lot from the Western musicians I'm working with. And my love for the steel guitar became even greater after I began to hear and appreciate what some of the current steel players on the scene at that time were doing. Mostly these were pedal steel players. And in my childhood, I was hearing both the pre-pedal
lap steel
and the Bud Isaac style steel, pedal steel thing that was coming in. But I was hearing jazz-oriented steel players on these gigs that I was playing, and with other bands that were playing in that genre. And that would be Maurice Anderson and Tom Morell and others not from around here like Curly Chalker, Buddy Emmons. And I was learning a great deal, and I loved the approach they had and the overall sound of jazz type playing on steel guitar. So when I finally was able to make the break into jazz, there remained with me memories of what I'd experienced in the country field. And in the 70s, I started a series of recordings, which I set out to do as pure jazz recordings. And yet, I think I remember the very incident that influenced me to include certain players. I was playing a country club, a private party, and in the next room was some of my old friends from Western swing days. And I remember the steel player was Jesse Harris. That's a name, you know, you don't hear much, but he was very good. He played at the Aragon Ballroom for something like 14 years straight, with some really good bands. The bands would change up, but he would stay the same. You know, they kept him on, and that triggered something. They were playing Cherokee when we walked in.
Of course.
And I thought, you know, that's something this area has that just can't be found a lot of other places. And so I didn't use Jesse, but I did start my series of jazz recordings, and I did call upon Maurice Anderson and Tom Morell for various recording dates. And these were jazz dates, but utilizing steel guitar as a jazz instrument.
Precisely. That's pretty much what Bob Dunn had done with his lap steel when he started playing it with Milton Brown.
Isn't that the truth?
Taking those trombone Dixieland influences and adapting and translating.
Yes,
amazing.
The truer words were never spoken. And he, I think, initially was a trombonist.
Yes. Yeah, the influence is so patent there that it's like, gosh, why didn't this occur to a whole lot of people at once? Well, because it's not the kind of thing that happens except once in perhaps a generation, and never in more than one region of the country.
Everyone else was playing Hawaiian music on that instrument.
It's a unique situation. I've always said that Fort Worth has a jazz history on a par with that of, say, Kansas City or New Orleans, any other jazz-oriented city you might mention. except we've never really
Yeah, if you
comprehended
bring in
it.
that aspect of it, yes.
And
it
I
certainly
really
does.
believe that the jazz influence in country music was probably more subversive than it was overt. The frustration of the players wanting to play that idiom in a market where the openness was not automatically there.
And that persisted to the day when I was playing in the Western bands, because the jazz-influenced players were playing the way they wanted to, whether or not the band leader was happy about it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there's many funny stories regarding that very kind of situation.
My favorite is the old sign that used to appear in dressing rooms in those clubs nice enough to have dressing rooms.
I didn't play any of those.
Well, once in a while, or sometimes it'd be at the backstage exit or at the men's room. Where's the melody? Big
Right.
sign, and it's like, okay, it's like, don't forget what you're here for.
Right.
Don't forget who's signing that paycheck. John, what year were you born?
1947.
Mine likewise.
Ah.
Your beginnings as a working musician came in what year then?
Bringing in 63, I believe. I believe that's right.
And that was
That was in Northeast Texas.
Northeast Texas.
We lived in Paris, and my very first gig was a New Year's Eve gig in Hugo, Oklahoma, playing electric bass. I really hadn't learned the instrument that well, but this was the type of music where it was sort of popular music of the day, but the bass would play a pattern. Would it be a pattern to play, you know,
Precisely,
to
yeah.
the songs? And it was the pattern was very much the same for a lot of different songs. I learned those patterns.
Yes, yes.
And my brother got me on that gig, and in the next few months, they brought me into the band that my brother and some of his buddies had. Another guitarist who had been in the band left, and they decided that piano might work in the band, so they brought me in on piano.
And so it might. And how early did you begin insinuating those jazz influences into what you were doing?
Well, when they hired me, I was very much in my learning years. I had started off with blues, as a lot of us do,
Yeah.
and a lot of what they were doing was bluesy kind of
Sure,
music.
12-bar structure.
And so what I had learned about playing blues fit in perfectly with what they were doing, and I wasn't much advanced beyond that, to be honest about it. At that time, I was doing good to hang in there and learn to play in some of the guitar chords that we were, yeah, guitar keys.
Wow.
D, E, A.
Nice work if you can get it. It's a good learning ground. Were you ever tempted to join the rock and roll scene?
No, not at that point.
And that's an unusual development in such a career, considering the time and the place.
Well, it all seems pretty natural to me, and let me back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, as a child performer, the first material I started trying to do as a kid, and it was, you know, it was at best just the novelty of a kid performing. We won't talk about quality here. But it was with traditional country material, or you know, going back to Carrie Rogers sent me a reissue of In the Jailhouse Now #2, and she had been a guest in our home, and so I learned that, and I sang that on some of the live shows that we had back when I was like 8 years old, something like that. Okay, in 1955, shortly after I'd become part of the family act, the Louisiana Hayride came to Paris and played the Boys Club there, and their headliner was Elvis Presley. And my mother told me who was coming to town, and I didn't even know who Elvis Presley was. She said, well, they're playing his records a lot on the radio, and so I started listening to the radio, and I heard Elvis Presley on the radio a whole lot.
Oh, yeah.
And that was an experience, to say the least, to see Presley in person in 1955, just before he signed with RCA. He was still on Sun.
Right.
It was just before he went with RCA and just before he made his first movie, Love Me Tender. And I was, you know, my whole idea about what I wanted to do was changed right then, and I immediately decided I wanted to be a rock and roller.
You had that inclination.
So, I went through my rock and roll phase when I was a kid.
But it was not to be professionally.
Right.
Amazing.
And you know, it seems very logical, Mike, because as I was listening to Presley and some of the other rock and roll, I would hear people say, well, this, you know, this actually comes from blues or rhythm and blues and stuff. And so eventually I became curious about where it was coming from, and so I started listening to some of the black artists.
Yeah.
And I became a real R&B fan. I couldn't translate that so well to the country music shows, you know.
No, although Moon Mullican seemed to have no.
Moon Mullican had a knack for it. Yeah,
it's an acquired ability.
and I respect the hell out of Moon Mullican.
Yes, yes.
But for myself, and when I heard Ray Charles, the first time I heard Ray Charles, I thought that was the ultimate.
Was that the Atlantic Ray Charles?
Yes. This was just before his big hit on What I Say.
Sure, 1958 or 9.
Yes. And so becoming a 100% Ray Charles fan and listening to everything I could find by Ray Charles, he just quite naturally led me into jazz.
Of course.
He straddled those genres.
He was going at 5 different careers all at once there, it seemed like, and doing straight ahead jazz, bordering on experimental.
And I liked his piano playing.
And his piano playing was very crisp and nuanced, very delicate style. I had never detected much Charles influence in your own playing, but that makes sense that you should.
You know, it doesn't come out except in certain type of material that we do. I mean, when we get a request for George on My Mind or something from that era or before, or somebody just wants to hear some blues, they'll hear some blues. I have a natural feel for the blues, and Ray Charles is a big influence on me.
Yeah, yeah, splendid work. The identification of you with Sardines, the restaurant, 23 years now.
I believe that's right. Well, I started in October of '83.
I think that's about the time you and I sat down and did that original career profile for the newspaper. And you had been at JR's, am I correct?
Yes.
On off Camp Bowie.
I brought a photograph or two from JR's.
In the Ridgely area. Splendid place. I miss that. I miss that.
Well, that was my first 6-night-a-week jazz gig.
And from that, you've built this into almost, well, it is a career.
Yes.
What else could you call it?
And you know, I'm not trying to be modest, but I feel very fortunate.
Yeah.
And a saxophone player told me many years ago, before I was playing jazz regularly, but he said, you know, you piano players are really lucky. He said, because if you want to, you'll always be able to find a gig somewhere playing, and you can make your living playing if you want to. It may not be exactly the kind of music you want to play, but you'll be able to keep your chops up. And of course, he was right. And of course, that's not true in an area such as this. If you're a saxophonist or a trumpet player, you know.
You've got that self-containment going for you.
I'm very fortunate, partly because of the instrument I play.
You've also developed a very loyal following. I know many people who are devotees today who were likewise a generation ago. So you've actually been almost conducting a living campus for the preservation and advancement of jazz. Is that a strategy, or did this?
No, it's just a gig, and it's what I love doing, and which is another reason why I'm so fortunate. I get to do what I love doing, and it's wonderful to see young people coming in, and usually they are musicians or aspiring musicians, but not always. Sometimes it's just people who are maybe taking a music appreciation class
Mm-hmm.
and interested in this form of music.
Yeah.
And it makes me feel good that it's going to continue well after I'm gone, and that it's going to continue.
Well, where else in this part of the world can you find it? The venues
not
are
much,
rare.
yeah.
The venues are very rare.
Yeah.
Now, your recording career began during the 1970s, as you mentioned, I believe. How many private label LPs have you generated in that process?
I think there's a dozen.
Yeah.
I believe.
The recording activity, I'm sure you recorded
As a sideman.
as a
with
sideman much more
yeah,
extensively.
Yeah, and I got back into the Western swing thing
Mm-hmm.
pretty strongly in 1990. That was not long after my mom passed away.
Right.
And I think that had some bearing on me wanting to do it.
Sure.
But yes, as a sideman, I've recorded on numerous Western swing projects.
Now, your release a few years ago of Waiting for the Moment, let me check myself on that. This seems to be the first mass market recording under your own name, is it not?
Yes.
How was that received? What sort of broadening did you feel in your career once that had reached a more generalized popular market?
I can't tell much difference.
Can't tell. But you are being heard by more people.
It did have wider distribution, and I've heard from some folks in Japan who like it and wanted more trio jazz. I can't tell a big difference, though. I can't tell a big difference.
You tend to make ripples in your own career, and I think this is a matter of partly artistic curiosity, intellectual curiosity, and political courage on top of everything else. But you've developed a very secure market share in this area of live jazz, almost on a nightly basis, with very few exceptions. The recent Love's Bitter Rage project and your rechristening to go along with that, how has that affected what you do as a working musician?
Well, at the restaurant, I pretty much play as I always have. There might be some Mideast influences that creep into my music from time to time, and I've had a few requests for some of the material from that CD, and I will play it if it's requested. And I sell CDs there, usually to people who know what to expect because of my stance. Could you very political stance?
Could you define that for us in brief? I don't want to speak for you.
Well, just very briefly, I'm opposed to current U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
And I wanted to make a statement regarding that. It was triggered by our invasion of Iraq, but as I began to educate myself, prompted by that action of the invasion, I began to learn about many practices of this country that I find very difficult to accept. The School of the Americas, for example. And that's my learning about that and the death squads that we train is what inspired me to write Love's Bitter Rage. And it's been accepted pretty well by most people. There's been a few exceptions to that.
Sure.
But most people have been willing to listen to it. Some people will say they're listening to it for the music, not the message.
I was about to say, can you tell whether they're responding to the music or to the gumption it takes to commit
yeah, I get
this
that
music?
from some people. But then there's others who say that, you know, they're with me on that message, and so that's all I can ask for. Is
And
for
the
people
whole
to
point
listen
is to create a discourse and get
Yes.
people considering that. People will, I think, for the long term, know and admire your work under the name Johnny Case, but sounds like John Costin's been making some impact as well. Waiting for the Moment was brought to my attention by Dwayne Durrett, who of course has been associated with Sumter Bruton and me as a drummer. So we have
Yes.
that artistry in common, and I was fascinated to see that you likewise with Dwayne had recorded Soft Winds.
Right.
In a distinct arrangement from the one that Dwayne had been performing with Sumter and my Swing Masters unit
Yeah.
for such a long time. How did that combination come about?
Well, Dwayne and I have known each other for many years, but very seldom had the opportunity to work together, and we'd never recorded together before.
Yeah.
So the engineer that I work with thought another trio CD was long overdue, and I decided to ask Dwayne if he would like to participate in that, and he said yes. But my association with Dwayne will lead us into talking about some of the great artists I heard in this town. James Clay
Oh, yeah.
was, I think, the greatest jazz musician that I ever had the privilege of working with. And I first heard him in, I think it was the late 60s. It was
Yeah.
probably 67 or 8. On the south side of Fort Worth at an after-hours club called the 964 Club on Evans Avenue.
Evans Avenue.
It was just a house that had been converted into a after-hours club.
Yeah.
And he was working there with Clyde Edward George on Hammond B3 organ,
Yeah.
his brother Raymond George on guitar, and this young white drummer, whom later I learned was Dwayne Durrett.
Durrett. Yeah, Raymond George played a gig with Sumter and me not too long ago.
Oh,
Stuff.
yes, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. And Dwayne and I are about the same age, I guess. And needless to say, this was predominantly a black audience there.
course,
I
yeah.
think my brother and I and Dwayne were probably the only 3 Caucasians there. And we listened to the music and just soaked it up. But we didn't really make any attempt to meet the musicians. We weren't seated very close to them.
Yeah.
So it wasn't convenient. So we didn't get to meet them. But of course, I remembered, and I don't remember when I actually did meet Dwayne Durrett. But we became friends almost immediately.
Sure.
And eventually, I did get to work with James Clay on several occasions, and what a wonderful experience it was. Also, of course, Marshall Ivory is another great tenor player in this area that I work with. The pianist that I probably was influenced by more than anyone as far as musicians in this area. Most of my influences, of course, come from recordings.
Right.
But as far as musicians that I knew personally, that would have been Thomas Reese.
Reese, exactly. I knew you were going to say Reese. What a
Yes.
great player.
And I met him in 1967, and we became friends immediately.
Yes.
And knew him off and on throughout the years. And he was subbing for me in recent years at the New Sardines.
Sure.
Up until he became very ill.
Uh-huh.
And we did a tribute for him one night,
remember
which he
that.
attended, and we had musicians from all over this area, from Dallas and Fort Worth, both some of the greatest jazz players took part in that. Now I brought the little brochure and stuff for the library here. I also have recordings of it.
Yeah. Reese, what a player.
But those were some of the, Charles Scott, the bassist who worked with me, he was Red Garland's favorite bass player when working in this area. And Charles Scott was with me at Sardines for about 7 years, I believe. These are some great players that I knew personally and worked with.
Rare occasion. Well, what's shaping up next in your career,
Well-
live or in the studio?
Well, as far as live, we just did perform avant-garde jazz for the first time at Sardines, and the manager has told me that he wouldn't mind at all seeing that happen, on a recurring basis. Not real often, but he said maybe 4 times a year or something like that.
Now, by avant-garde, for the uninitiated viewer, you're talking about freeform.
Freeform. Totally improvised music in our instance. I mean,
Yes.
not all avant-garde is totally improvised,
Correct.
but that's what we're doing. And of course, one of the innovators of that was Ornette Coleman, who is from Fort Worth.
Oh, yeah.
And there's been many innovators, of course, in that type of music. And some of my influences would include Cecil Taylor, Albert Ayler, the tenor player, Sun Ra, Don Pullen was an influence, and others. And now there are quite a number of musicians in the area who are interested in that kind of music and play it very well.
And feel very comfortable in
Very comfortable.
playing them. So, yeah, my big influence in that for many years was Lenny Tristano.
Yes, well, he was ahead of his time, for sure.
Who actually pronounced jazz to be nothing more than the art of feeling. Forget the
Didn't know that he
technical,
said that.
forget the technical business, forget the notation, forget the timing, just tear into it.
That's, yeah, well, that's interesting that he said that, and I'm glad he did, because his music is very complex.
Yes.
But a lot of people, they only hear that, and they don't understand that you can just, you don't have to understand it in a technical sense to appreciate it. You
Well,
can
that's
just
the
let it
beauty.
wash over you.
I think the beauty of the audience we often find around here, whether or not we are courting that audience, is that so many people in this part of the world are so receptive to something new. And as you were saying earlier, I think there might be a lot to be made of the fact that the more extreme forms of rock and roll may have relaxed the barriers for people to be more receptive to free jazz.
I think that's true.
That's a consideration I hadn't made before, and it might bear investigation.
I think I'm onto something here.
Yeah, we'll add that to the list of explorations, and I hope we get a chance to do this again, because I know you've got a lot more stories to tell.
I sure have enjoyed it, Michael.
Delighted, Tom. Thank you. This is Mike Price. We'll be back again with more Jazz Perspectives.